My name is Wade Davis. I work as the explorer in residence of the National Geographic Society. I'm their social anthropologist, and I'm a writer. But much of what I do is celebrate the wonder of culture around the world and try to get people to understand the sort of central revelation of anthropology, which is the idea that the world into which you were born doesn't exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, and the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you, but they're unique answers to a fundamental question: what does it mean to be human and alive? Well, from an anthropological point of view, it's the fact that the day that you were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Now, a language is not just vocabulary or grammar. A language is the flash of the human spirit. It's a means by which the soul of every culture comes in the world. And of those 7,000 languages, half aren't being taught to infants, which means they're on the road to extinction, which means by any definition, we're living through a generation or two where half of humanity's social, spiritual, ecological knowledge has been lost in a generation. You cannot speak Brazilian Portuguese without becoming a sexier person. It's impossible. You know, every language is linked to landscape, and every culture springs from a spirit of place. And so you can acquire another language, but fluency really only comes to those born into a language. And so when you think of sort of small indigenous languages, the very lens upon which they view the landscape is something that can't be approached by an outside language. It's not possible. I mean, if you think even here in Australia, think how language creates misunderstanding in a sense. You know, when the British first arrived in Australia, they met a people that looked strange, who had a simple technology, but what really offended the British is that the Aboriginal people had no interest in improving upon their lot. And since that was the ethos of 19th and 18th century Britain, the British weren't only kind of bewildered, they were offended. And so naturally they became, just in their inimitable way, they concluded the Aboriginal people weren't human beings. And as recently as 1902, lifetime of my grandfather, it was debated in this city, in the Parliament in Melbourne, as to whether Aboriginal people were human beings or not. But what was missing was the fact that the Aboriginal civilization was the antithesis of progress. The entire devotional trajectory was stasis. It was to not improve upon one's lot, but rather to do the ritual gestures necessary to maintain the world exactly as it was at the time of the rainbow serpent or the first dawning. And the interesting thing is not to say who's right and who's wrong, but had human beings as a whole followed that intellectual devotional trajectory, yes, we wouldn't have put a man on the moon, but we also wouldn't be talking about climate change and our capacity to transform the biological life support systems of the planet. Well, not really. I mean, we have this sort of idea that these cultures, quaint and colorful, are somehow destined to fade away as if they're failed attempts at being us or failed attempts at being modern. Nothing could be further from the truth. All cultures are always dancing with new possibilities for life. Change is the one constant in human affairs. Technology is no threat to culture. It can empower culture, in fact. These aren't delicate societies. These are dynamic living peoples being driven out of existence by identifiable forces, whether that's egregious industrial initiatives, whether it's a cult of modernity, whether it's a triumph of Marxist-Leninist ideology. And that recognition is actually a very optimistic observation, because it suggests if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can be the facilitators of cultural survival. Well, I think these kinds of conferences sort of, again, I sort of tend to view everything through the anthropological lens, and I think it's kind of interesting because I think post-secondary university systems have to some extent become calcified. You know, the demands on a professor are so intense, and yet their specialization tends to be, by definition, so narrowly delimited. And there are a lot of challenges within the university system, and it's not clear to me that that system is really addressing the intellectual needs and the rate of change in our society. And it seems interesting that not just this conference here in Melbourne, but you know, the phenomenal success of TED, for example, and I'm on the brain trust of TED, or I guess you'd call it the board of TED, and it's been amazing to see the global response to that kind of production of information and dissemination of knowledge. It's phenomenal. You know, when we began those TED Talks, I remember Chris Anderson, it was debated amongst many of the people close to the heart of TED whether or not, you know, first of all, would our speakers be prepared to give away, in effect, their intellectual property? Well, of course, everybody was, because it's like the Beatles said, the more you give, the more you get. And indeed, the success of those TED Talks, I think, speaks to a new way that information is being disseminated. And I know that whereas there are many wonderful people working in traditional university professions, I know from my own experience, having gone through that world to the level of a PhD, that many of the most interesting people that certainly came through when I was going through graduate school actually branched out to do much more kind of innovative and wilder things. And I think within that wildness was born innovation. And if you think of, for example, the kind of serendipitous way in which the entire tech world flashed into being within our lifetimes, all of that was coming from people who thought outside of the box. You know, I gave my commencement address to my daughter's graduation at college, and it was actually it was a year after the big economic meltdown in the States, and famously 70% of college graduates couldn't get jobs. So I looked up the origin of the word job, and it turns out it comes from the medieval French word gober, meaning to devour, whereas the word work comes from the Anglo-Saxon root, meaning to create and inspire. So one of the lessons I think all of us should pursue is the avoidance of anything that resembles a job, but dedication to work at a level harder than anyone will ever encounter. And that's sort of where I think these conferences are touching upon original thinkers, a means for them to come together, for people who may not be on the stage but are part of the event nevertheless. So there's none of this sort of, you know, professorial speaking to a static audience. There's a very dynamic interchange behind the scenes, during the conference, at the sessions, that really foments a kind of intellectual spark, and that's what everybody craves. Kind of work by Marshall McLuhan's adage, if it works, it's obsolete. And one of the things I think we really, in a most disingenuous way, we suggest to young people is that life is linear, that if you go from A to B to C, if you skip D, E, and F, you'll never get to the rest of the alphabet. Well, life is made up of these remarkable serendipitous moments. I mean, I became an anthropologist because the deadline for deciding was the following day, and I happened to walk through the museum dioramas at the Peabody at Harvard, and these fantastic images of Indians sort of dressed in these psychedelic robes and everything. And I walked out in the spring sunshine in Cambridge and ran into a friend of mine. I said, "What are you going to study?" He said, "Anthropology." I said, "What's that?" "Well, you study Indians, like Forrest Gump." I said, "That'll do." You know, and I became a botanist because I got tired of just reading about Indians in a book. And I was with my roommate in Harvard Square, and by chance in the cafe there was a National Geographic map of the world right in front of us. And suddenly David looked at the map, and he looked to me, he looked at the map, and he looked to me, and he lifted his arm and he pointed to the Arctic. Well, I had to go somewhere, so I lifted my hand and it went to the Amazon. Had it hit Italy, I might have become a Renaissance scholar, but within 2 weeks David was in the Arctic and I was in the Amazon, where I stayed on that first trip for a year and a half. I think that's how life really unfolds, and so I always say to young people, be opportunists, not in the sense of being schemers, but put yourself in the way of opportunities, and always do what seems to be impossible, because if you place yourself into a situation where success is the only option, you find yourself achieving levels of competence that would have been unimaginable to you but a few short weeks before. And you know, despair is an insult to the imagination, you know, I think that you know, if you say yes to every opportunity, you know, you can find, I mean, the biggest challenge in life is to become the architect of your own life. You know, in middle age, bitterness comes to those upon whom these choices were imposed, and contentment comes to those who can look back over a long life and realize they may not have made all the right decisions, but they own those decisions. And so in that sense, they structured their own reality. And what I always say to young people is be patient. Give your destiny time to find you.